Welcome to our third plenary lecture. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor David Chinitz, Professor and now Chair of the Department of English at Loyola University, Chicago. He was one of the editors of our landmark publication in Eliot Studies, The Complete Prose, which was awarded the 2019 MLA Prize for Scholarly Edition. In 2013, he published T.S. Eliot and the Cultural Divide, which explored the presence of popular culture in Eliot's work. And I think we can justly say that that was a book that caused us to see Eliot in a totally different light. Other publications on Eliot or modernism include Blackwell Companion to T.S. Eliot, which he edited, and A Companion to Modernist Poetry, which he co-edited with Gail MacDonald. His next present project is Eliot Now, a collective volume co-edited with Megan Quigley, which I think he will be referring to later. Interestingly, he has also done research and published on Langston Hughes, Which Sin to Bear, Authenticity and Compromise in Langston Hughes. He has served as president of the Modernist Studies Association and the International T.S. Eliot Society. And finally, something I'd like to point out, he's responsible for the section Public Sightings of Time Present, the newsletter of the International T.S. Eliot Society, where he spots allusions to Eliot and his work in the media. And the title of his talk today is quite a direct question. Does T.S. Eliot have a future? So thank you very much, David, for being one of our keynote speakers, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Didak. I'd like to thank you and the board of the EAAS and the conference organizing committee for inviting me to give this talk. Okay. I feel particularly honored to be speaking to a European association not long after editing volume 6 of Eliot's Complete Prose, the volume corresponding to the World War II years. Speaking to such an organization as this strikes me as something Eliot himself was often asked to do. In volume 6, in volume 6, we encounter him attempting to speak to the Italians just as the war was being declared, regretting the Soviet occupation of Estonia, mourning Yeats to the Irish, addressing the Swedes, Czechs, and Portuguese over the course of the war, broadcasting over the BBC on the liberation of Rome, writing an article for a magazine that the Royal Air Force airdropped into occupied France as Allied propaganda, writing on Chekhov and Kipling for the Russians, and speaking to the Germans partly in German just 10 months after the end of the war. His consistent goal in all this international discourse was to contribute what he could to the broken unity of Europe by emphasizing the continent's common cultural heritage. He saw this work as the responsibility of what he called men of letters, regardless of their political differences. There's an implicit optimism in Eliot's shouldering of this responsibility, a sense that his words, especially if supplemented by other voices in the community of letters, might have some effect on the world. He needed to believe, against all the apparent odds at that historical moment, that Europe would survive, and survive as Europe, as a concept, and as an entity exhibiting cultural diversity within a fundamental cultural unity based, as he repeatedly said, on the traditions of Rome, Greece, and Israel. But what of Eliot himself? Will he survive this historical moment? And to the extent that he does, will he survive as Eliot? Will he continue to be the recognizable cultural figure he has been despite certain vicissitudes of reputation since the publication of The Wasteland 100 years ago? Will his name remain one that an educated person throughout much of the world must know? Will he continue to be taught in the universities and to arouse the interest of scholars? Will he continue to find readers? I would describe Eliot's immediate standing as healthy. He's neither indiscriminately adulated, as he was in the mid-20th century, nor reflexively abused, as he was in the late 20th century. Since around the year 2000, give or take, Eliot has fallen back, as the critic Jay Perini puts it, into his rightful place in the pantheon of poets, of modern poets, a worthy voice beside others. He remains important. Eliot is still even able to make headlines, as the opening up of his letters to Emily Hale showed 2 years ago, a couple of months before the COVID pandemic. As Didak mentioned, Megan Quigley and I are co-editing a volume of essays called Eliot Now, in which the contributors discuss Eliot in thoroughly contemporary ways with respect to current literary critical interests, such as the Anthropocene, trans studies, the digital humanities, race, and translation theory. It's clear that Eliot can be, without any forcing, a figure of interest in all these areas. And in fact, criticism of Eliot has not slackened in recent years. All our contributors have been asked to make use of new Eliot texts, the complete prose, the scholarly edition of the poems, the ongoing series of his letters. With the publication at last of Eliot's entire oeuvre, which his widow had prevented for many years before finally acceding to its necessity, it would seem that all the pieces are in place for a golden era of Eliot scholarship that Ronald Schuhard has heralded in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Still, I'm not particularly optimistic about Eliot's future beyond today's efflorescence. My purpose in this paper is to explain why and to solicit your reactions to my concerns. I'm particularly aware that many things may look different from a European perspective than from my American standpoint, and I hope you'll let me know how. I'll begin with a story. In Syracuse, New York, during the summer of 2019, a squirrel bit a power line and electrocuted itself. For 14 days, the dead animal hung on the wire by its teeth, while disgusted residents complained to the electric utility and the county and city governments to no avail. The neighbors began blogging sarcastically about the squirrel, whom they posthumously christened Freddie, after the 1972 Curtis Mayfield song, Freddie's Dead. After 2 weeks, the blog caught the media's attention, and the power company finally came at night to extricate Freddie from the wires. Blogger Chet Seidel posted a video of the removal process captioned, "This is the way the squirrel ends, not with a bang, but a whimper." Since 2007, I've been collecting unexpected, weird, and sometimes wonderful references to Eliot in public, non-scholarly contexts, and the story of Freddie the squirrel is one of the strangest. My discoveries are published in a column called Public Sightings in the International T.S. Eliot Society's thrice-yearly newsletter. So I can't help but take note when the federal judge sentencing the September 11th terrorist Zakaria Moussaoui to life in prison tells him, "You came here to be a martyr and to die in a big bang of glory. But to paraphrase the poet T.S. Eliot, you will die with a whimper." Or when two different political columnists independently observe that a partial government shutdown imposed by the then Republican-led Congress is about to end not with a bang, but a whimper. Or when the onset of a pandemic inspires a tedious litany of paraphrases such as, "This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a run on the supermarkets, not with a bang, but a shortage of toilet paper, not with a bang, but a virus." Eliot's invocations of doom are always apt in a crisis, but then again, as Eliot himself wrote in 1964, "I should be glad to hear no more of a bang and a whimper." Hollowman references have become so routine that I've almost stopped collecting them. As these examples show, Eliot is still a recognized cultural figure, but one increasingly boiled down to a few endlessly recycled lines and sayings. For many literate people, the name Eliot is associated more with "April is the cruelest month" and "not with a bang but a whimper" than with the poems from which these phrases come, or the oeuvre to which the poems belong. The way the opening line of The Wasteland is popularly deployed clearly indicates how detached it has become from its meaning in that poem. Mid-spring blizzards, the opening of the baseball season for a perpetually losing team, the deadline for income tax payments in the United States, the terrifying descent of the coronavirus pandemic in April 2020, any sort of unfortunate event occurring in April is sure to elicit either a winking or a deadly serious reference to the first 5 words of The Wasteland. And virtually all of these instances misread the line, missing the point that April is cruel not because it brings bad weather or death, but because it brings good weather and life. My point is that "April is the cruelest month" circulates as a soundbite in ways that bear almost no relation to The Wasteland per se. The Eliot who survives in the popularity of this line is an extraordinarily hollowed out figure, more famous for having written these famous words than for any whole piece of writing he authored or for anything he actually stood for. A journalist wrote in 2017, "As T.S. Eliot said in The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, this April is proving to be a cruel month." In that hapless conflation of Eliot with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, we see that Eliot signifies merely an authoritative and quotable voice from the past. Like Tennyson's Ulysses, he has become a name, or perhaps one might say, a hollow man. In a more sophisticated yet still unnuanced way, Eliot is often pared down to a single element of his work and thought. In an essay on Eliot's celebrity, Aaron Jaffe uses the metaphor of worn coins to refer to versions of Eliot that are circulated to the point that they become empty truisms. In all cases, Jaffe explains, the more exposed and diffused Eliot is as a cultural signifier before diverse publics, the more the signifier becomes little, almost nothing. Eliot, the impenetrably abstruse poet, and Eliot, the amusingly eccentric, exaggerated Englishman, are coins that wore out during his lifetime. Eliot, the champion of the highbrow and perpetual enemy of mass culture, circulated much longer and so became the windmill I tilted at in my first book. As circulated in popular culture since the 1980s is Eliot the racial bigot, and especially the anti-Semite. The problem here with regard to Eliot's reputation is not the attribution of bigotry, which he earned fair and square, but its deployment as a byword. Jaffe cites the 2005 film Art School Confidential, in which John Malkovich's character remarks, "Should we judge an artist by what he does in his personal life? If he's an anti-Semite like T.S. Eliot, or a bully like Picasso, or in this case, a murderer, does this mean his art has any less value? I think not." Used this way, the name Eliot has become a cliche, as Jaffe remarks, for personal bigotry that either does or does not nullify an artist's value. The point is not which side the writer comes down on, but that Eliot has been reduced to a counter in an ongoing debate. During the first wave of the Me Too movement, I observed a spike in the appearance of this particular worn coin. For example, in a November 2017 New York Times opinion piece, the writer states, "Caravaggio was a murderous thug. Ezra Pound was a pro-fascist and pro-Nazi anti-Semite. Virginia Woolf had an anti-Semitic streak of her own. T.S. Eliot out and out hated Jews. Picasso treated the women in his life abysmally. Two killed themselves." Leaving aside the dubious extremity of the writer's claim about Eliot, the thing to notice here is how much of the quotation from the 2005 film is repeated in the 2017 article. Picasso the bully and Eliot the anti-Semite are back. Even the murderous painter is back. The real concern of this article is what to do with contemporary figures such as the actor Kevin Spacey, who turn out to be creeps or sexual predators. The names Eliot, Picasso, and the rest are indeed, in this context, not so much individual artists as evidentiary nuggets that are instantly recognizable and thus transcend whichever side the writer is invoking in debate. In a very recent Washington Post opinion piece, this time concerned primarily with Eliot, the literary critic Michael Derda recirculates the same coinage. Art and morality belong to separate spheres. Flawed, often seriously flawed people create immortal works. Are Gesualdo's madrigals and Caravaggio's masterpieces any less beautiful because the composer and the painter were murderers? One misses only Picasso to complete the triad. These references are effective only because readers still know who Eliot and Picasso are. And perversely, they may actually even help keep them in the public eye as major artists. Jaffe points out how closely linked are notoriety and fame. And by now, this problematic side of Eliot has been largely absorbed and assimilated by criticism. We've gotten used to it. Eliot has lost standing because of his racial bigotry. But up till now, at any rate, he has also survived it. But the combination of that worn coin with a newer one, that of Eliot, the cultural bigot, is far more dangerous to his future. The first draft of a chapter submitted by a contributor to Eliot Now describes Eliot's After Strange Gods as notorious even within a career filled with eloquent defenses of white Christian superiority. She later criticizes the academic labor that has brought nuanced context to Eliot's oft-expressed belief in the Christian West as the fount and telos of human civilization. This is a very important criticism, and not because it's valid. Did Eliot, in fact, often express belief in the Christian West as the fount and telos of human civilization? The question I've been considering is more like, did Eliot ever express such a belief? My colleague doesn't cite even one instance in After Strange Gods or anywhere else in which Eliot actually claims that white Christian culture is superior to any other developed culture. If she tried, she must have come up empty because Eliot did not believe that. He had plenty to say about the cultural past and future of Europe, and he certainly wished to see Christianity restored to the center of Western culture. He argued that a Christian Europe was a better Europe, but that's a long way from arguing that Christian Europe is superior to Indian culture or Japanese culture, for example. In both his poetry and prose, Eliot is consistently respectful of non-European civilizations. The crucial point, though, is not that my colleague is wrong, but that she believes she is right. And not only that, but that the point is so widely known as to require no evidence. Eliot, the cultural bigot, may be a counterfeit worn coin, but it's also a potent one at a moment when academic attitudes toward literature are in transition. My colleague compares Eliot's place in the literary firmament with the statues of pro-slavery historical figures whose removal as public monuments has been increasingly demanded by liberal and moderate Americans. To the extent that Eliot's alleged belief in the Christian West as the fount and telos of human civilization has become a canard and a commonplace, Eliot's future may really be analogous to the statue of a Confederate general. I think, though, that there is an even greater threat to Eliot's future than a censorious view of his racial and cultural attitudes. To explain, I'll begin with a quotation from 4 quartets. Words strain, crack, and sometimes break under the burden, under the tension, slip, slide, perish, decay with imprecision, will not stay in place, will not stay still. In this comment on language, Eliot elaborates on a basic fact we all know to be true, but that most of us would rather not think about. Words will not stay still. Language changes, and what was once clear expression becomes, in time, incomprehensible. What Wegardania Nyardagum, Theod Kuniga, Thrum Yafrunin, Hutha Ethelengus Ellen Fremedon. So runs the first sentence of the Anglo-Saxon epic Beowulf, in an English no longer used by English-speaking peoples. Today, only an expert can read these lines with understanding. The words have slipped, slid, and perished. The English of Chaucer is closer to modern English, but here too, both pronunciation and comprehension require specialized knowledge. High school and college students today can still read Shakespeare with a lot of help, but how long will it be before they can't? And Shakespeare, too, will have to be read and performed in translation or relegated to a few specialists who can still read 15th century English. One might assume that modernist poetry, including Eliot's, would have several hundred years to run before Eliot's English and ours takes its place beside Chaucer's, and maybe several hundred more before it becomes as alien as the language of Beowulf. But linguistic familiarity is not the only expertise that makes a text readable. Culture also becomes unfamiliar over time, and that happens much more quickly. My students, for the most part, have no more idea of who Josephine Baker or Enrico Caruso or Edith Piaf was than most of us have when Beowulf invokes the deeds of Schuld Shaving. True, we can find out in a few seconds that Schuld was the legendary ancestor of the Danish royal lineage known as the Schuldings. Thank you, Wikipedia. Which makes us slightly more informed, but hardly invokes the feelings that Anglo-Saxons, familiar with his legend, must have felt when Schuld was mentioned in Beowulf. In the same way, students have no image of Louis Armstrong, Maurice Chevalier, or even Jacqueline Kennedy. You can describe who they were, but that's just a datum to our students. No one can really understand the significance of a cultural constituent if you've just had to explain it to them. It follows that even if the English language changes slowly, a poet may become effectively illegible to readers if the culture that informs their work becomes alien to them. Consider how deeply an appreciation of the neoclassical poet Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock depends on our familiarity with classical epic. If the conventions of Homer and Virgil aren't at one's mental fingertips, Pope's satire means almost nothing, and his humor is invisible. And as Euro-American bourgeois culture continues to recede into the past, I wonder how much the work of authors from Jane Austen to Henrik Ibsen to the 20th century modernists is lost on today's readers. Actually, I don't wonder. I can see how remote the literary assault on bourgeois culture feels to my students. What can Pound's Les Milwyn or even Eliot's love song of J. Alfred Prufrock mean to young readers for whom the existence of such people as the Milwyns and Prufrock is just an historical datum? Even so, I think that the fading memory of bourgeois culture poses less of a problem for Eliot than current trends in academia do. In classical studies, for example, at least in the US, there's a substantial counter-movement involving notable scholars who argue that the story Western civilization tells itself about its descent from the fetishized cultures of Greece and Rome developed to justify and reinforce white supremacy, and that story still does reinforce white supremacy. These classicists believe that classical studies, as we know it, must die. In one possible outcome, classical studies could metamorphose into ancient Mediterranean studies, treating Greece and Rome as two civilizations among many from Egypt, the Levant, and other neighboring areas, and as bearing no special ancestral relation to modern European culture. This reconception of the field would remove the so-called classical civilizations from their pedestal and make them the object of sociological study like other ancient cultures, rather than treating Greek and Roman art and literature as, well, classics. In any case, these ideas are not merely are not merely theoretical. These changes are happening now in many universities. I want to be very clear that I'm not speaking either in support or condemnation of these developments. That would be a whole other discussion, and in the case of classical studies, certainly one to which I would bring no real expertise. Instead, I'm here to ask this question. If, in the future, classical studies as such is no longer pursued, how would that affect the way tomorrow's readers process T.S. Eliot? What would such a change mean to Eliot's significance as a writer? Literature departments are also trending away from a focus on traditional literary history and the canon. English departments are a modern development originally structured to cover what is sometimes called the story of English, from the medieval period through the 18th and 19th century British literature. Contemporary literature was excluded on the grounds that one couldn't know what modern writing would, as the phrase goes, stand the test of time. In the mid-20th century, the intense interest in modernist literature, and Eliot in particular, drove a wedge into the English department's exclusive focus on historical literature. Young faculty and their students wanted to study Eliot. And in light of his poetry and criticism, modernist literature appeared sufficiently substantial to be an appropriate object of teaching and scholarship. To make a long story short, The balance since then has gradually shifted away from the study of historical English literature and increasingly toward contemporary literature. The focus is more on literature now rather than on what earlier generations regarded as the monuments of literature in English. It's clear that this trend is going to continue for the foreseeable future. And of course, that isn't the only change. The objections to the literary canon that were controversial 50 years ago are truisms today. We know that women writers who were once considered important seem to fail the test of time with a suspicious regularity, and that notable writers of color were long treated, if at all, as a sideshow, rather than being incorporated into the canon alongside their white contemporaries. To right these wrongs, the range of literature that gets taught has greatly expanded. During my 4 years as chair at Loyola, for example, we've hired new colleagues in comparative American minority literature, world Anglophone literature, and most recently, Native American literature. To make room for new faculty teaching in new fields, the departmental focus on the story of English has had to give way. These changes may have knocked Eliot down a peg or two, but they have not so far proven fatal. The current emphasis on decolonizing the English curriculum goes beyond expanding the canon for reasons much like the criticisms of the revolutionizing classicists. As the frequently quoted Kiel Manifesto for Decolonizing the Curriculum from Kiel University in Staffordshire explains, our world is still shaped by a long colonial history in which white upper-class men are at the top of the social hierarchy, and most disciplines give disproportionate significance to the experiences, histories, and achievements of this one group. To alter this imbalance, the argument runs, involves more than incremental changes in the curriculum. It requires that the old canon, or what Eliot called the tradition, capital T, be both thoroughly decentered and taught in a way that demonumentalizes it. I don't think that this movement is a cyclical trend and that the imaginary pendulum will swing back in a few years' time. One driving force behind it is that the populations of the US and the UK are changing, and the populations of the universities with them. As the faculty who are teaching literature and the students who are studying it are less and less those who feel a strong ancestral tie to the history and culture of Europe, it's inevitable that other interests will come to the fore. Social change will always lead to new emphases in what is taught and learned. How could it not? What then are the consequences of this trend for T.S. Eliot? The less interesting question for me is how much Eliot will be taught in decolonized English departments, though that's certainly a question. The really intriguing conundrum is this: how will this move away from teaching not Eliot himself, but Eliot's tradition affect the way tomorrow's readers process him? When the elements of culture Eliot considered important no longer hold a central position in the curriculum, will he be at all interesting to those future readers? When, in time, even English majors have limited exposure to the poetry Eliot admired, the movements he reacted against, the sources he alluded to, will he even be intelligible to them? If those sound like rhetorical questions, they are. Eliot without humanism may well be impossible. I've been trying to think my way through a number of possible objections and alternatives to the conclusion I've just suggested. For example, one might note that students today are already little versed in Eliot's humanist tradition, yet with their instructor's guidance, they're still able to engage with his poetry, including even The Wasteland. The membership of the International T.S. Eliot Society has grown younger, not older, over the past 20 years, which suggests that Eliot still holds an appeal for younger readers. But then, Those readers have not come through the revolutionized curriculum envisioned by decolonization. Again, the problem is not Eliot now, but Eliot later. Another potential objection is this: why am I so convinced that what goes on in academia will dictate Eliot's future? Doesn't a great deal of reading go on outside the classroom, especially among the kinds of readers who might be interested in Eliot? And haven't I pointed out just a few minutes ago that Eliot had a substantial public before he was even taught in the universities? Well, yes, that's all true. And maybe Eliot, exiled together with his tradition from the academy, will recapture his early status as an underground figure, passionately appreciated by those in the know. Maybe. But I think it's fair to say that most of Eliot's readers were first introduced to him by their teachers. And if the teachers aren't teaching Eliot, the population of readers interested in Eliot's poetry is at least going to be much smaller than it is now. Fewer readers will be exposed to him or immersed in the humanist tradition in which he is intelligible. And today's students are tomorrow's teachers. So who will be there in the next generation to spark an interest in Eliot? The academy aside, there are other reasons too why the portents are not good for Eliot. Reading as a leisure activity has been on the decline for decades, including reading of the 18th and 19th century literature Eliot could safely assume was familiar to his audience. The King James Version of the Bible, the standard translation through which readers incidentally gained familiarity with 17th century English language and syntax, has been increasingly displaced by more modern translations. That may be an improvement for religious purposes, but for popular literary knowledge, it's rather a disaster. In short, we're seeing declining exposure for many reasons to the cultural past against which backdrop Eliot's work takes its meaning. Will this rapid evolution in culture not lead to Eliot's becoming rather soon what Chaucer has become through centuries of evolution in the English language? Perhaps the concern I'm expressing with Eliot's having a large readership in his being taught in the schools and remaining a name cited by journalists and editorialists, maybe that's misplaced. After all, mass literacy is a relatively recent historical phenomenon. And there were those who cultivated a taste in literature long before educating most of the population was even seen as a desirable social goal. Should it not be satisfactory if some discerning few continue to know and read Eliot? My first answer to that question is a simple no. As an American, I can't help but feel that becoming the property of a highly educated coterie is an unhappy fate for any author to suffer. Possibly such cultural egalitarianism is something I need to get over, but it dies hard. More importantly, though, there's a historical issue here that can't be wished away. Byron, for example, had the readership that mattered in his time. The English aristocracy were mad for him. There was a smallish educated class who read him, or his romantic contemporaries, or their 18th century predecessors. That public no longer exists. So where exactly would those imaginary discerning readers who will still know Eliot 50 years from now, where will they come from and who will they be? As for the idea that Eliot might resume his original place as an underground hero, I think that's possible, but most likely in a way that greatly disturbs me. Before he was taught in the schools, Eliot was perceived as a revolutionary innovator. And even if they wanted nothing to do with his personal politics, young poets found his poetry a liberating model for new art. I'm thinking here of the Auden generation, but also of countless lesser 20th century writers and readers who considered Eliot their champion. But Eliot and his modernist cohort won their battle against the poetic traditionalists of their time. And as a result, poetry after Eliot has remained experimental. Eliot is no longer, and will never again be, a revolutionary figure. There are more current champions of the modern in verse, poets whose concerns are more contemporary and who require less background in the history of literature to appreciate. In such a context, it's difficult to imagine Eliot's becoming again a countercultural figure, unless, that is, some group perceives him as subverting a dominant paradigm they oppose. And that brings me to my greatest worry about Eliot's future, which is not his possible unemployment, but his possible redeployment. In following the press for my public sightings column, I found that Eliot was quoted more urgently and often by political commentators in the United States during the Trump administration than in the preceding decade, with The Wasteland and The Hollow Man again running far ahead of anything else Eliot wrote. The recirculation of a few quotations and concepts from those two poems became so insistent during those years that I had to stop reporting on them in public sightings, lest it become dully repetitive, and also lest someone accuse me of harnessing Eliot to my own politics. What struck me most, though, was that Eliot was being used against Trump, not so much by the left, but by the Republican intellectuals of the anti-Trump right. This says something about Eliot's usefulness today that may have disquieting implications for his future. Not all, certainly, but most of the Eliot scholars I know are of the center left. But there are those who still see him as a symbol of cultural and religious traditionalism, as against political correctness, atheism, and nihilism. For some of these writers, Eliot, the conservative juggernaut, is nothing more than another worn coin. But others, to give them due credit, show a solid understanding of his work, enough that they can deploy him to bolster their own political or religious views in ways that, while still very selective, are at least plausible. If Eliot's future lies with these writers, he'll be not so much another Beowulf or Confederate statue as another Ayn Rand. For me, such an outcome would be exasperating, but it concerns me even more that Eliot may find a future underground existence with people yet further to the right, who might put his authority to much worse uses, such as justifying their own anti-Semitism. To quote one of Eliot's short essays, "This is a future in which we ought not to be interested." A friend of mine who teaches at a university funded by the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest evangelical Christian sect in America, believes that Eliot will always be taught there. It does seem quite possible that Eliot will be more of a presence at religious institutions than elsewhere in the future, and that he'll still find admirers among the religious. Again, though, if the European humanist tradition is decentered elsewhere, how long can Eliot's reputation hold out even among the Southern Baptists? For that matter, can Christian humanism really survive in the context of a wider social rejection of humanism? Eliot himself argued the converse, writing in Notes Toward the Definition of Culture, "It is against a background of Christianity that all our thought has its significance. An individual European may not believe that the Christian faith is true, and yet what he says and makes and does will all spring out of his heritage of Christian culture and depend upon that culture for its meaning." This begs the question of how far Christianity and the tradition of European humanism can be severed, which goes far beyond the scope of this paper, but suffice it to say that regarding Eliot's future, the faith even of the redoubtable Southern Baptist does not leave me in hope. That said, what does one make of the fact that there are active T.S. Eliot societies in Japan and South Korea? Or of the fact that the majority of individuals who follow the International T.S. Eliot Society's Facebook page are not from Great Britain or North America, but from India and Pakistan? The energetic East Asian Eliot societies pose a particular challenge to my thesis, because Japan and Korea were never European protectorates, and the education systems there are not especially beholden to Western cultural traditions. If Eliot has a following in societies where his tradition is peripheral, then I can't discount the possibility that my argument is alarmist. This is something I'll need to investigate. Eliot's hold on readers in the former British Raj is less difficult to explain. The question in India is whether he'll survive Hindu nationalism with its purposeful de-emphasis on the cultural values and histories inherited from the British. I have not so far taken on the aesthetic argument for Eliot's future, which runs something like this. Whatever else one thinks of him, Eliot was a great poet, and his work continues to stand up to critical scrutiny. In short, he's too good to be forgotten, whatever the political and cultural, or wherever the political and cultural winds may blow. I think I've already laid the groundwork for the demolition of that claim. Even leaving aside any argument based on the contingency of value, excellence is no guarantee of a substantial continuing readership. An anonymous poet wrote the wonderful medieval English long poems Pearl and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. As exceptional as that poet must have been to have written two such works, his creations are now the province of specialists. That is not true of Eliot at this point. Recondite though he is, Eliot is still read by non-specialists. In fact, a 2009 BBC poll showed that he was still Britain's favorite poet, followed closely by John Donne. And in the United States, Time magazine declared Eliot the poet of the century at the 20th century's close. Clearly, a taste for Eliot now is no rarity, but Eliot later, in a decolonized literary culture? I'd like to close this talk by giving Eliot himself a chance to speak. What did he say that might bear on this question of his own future? It strikes me that Eliot is a great eschatological poet. I didn't say scatological, though we know now that he was that too from time to time. I'm speaking rather of eschatology, or concern with last things, with the end of history or of the world. The word derives from the biblical Greek eschatos, meaning farthest or last. The Hollow Men, not only in its final lines about the way the world ends, but throughout, is Eliot's most obviously eschatological poem. Its speakers are already, according to themselves, dead, as we see them groping together in a kind of underworld, death's dream kingdom, or the dead land, this last of meeting places. The scene may or may not be metaphorical, a representation of the post-war social milieu or of Eliot's own depression. Whatever one takes it to mean, the poem shows us a world that has reached its ghostly end. The Hollow Men is a distillation of the wasteland, which presents much the same situation more complexly and arguably more richly. Here, too, we have human beings inhabiting a dead land, the phrase recurs, and who are terrified enough of the approaching end of their world that they would rather live in a grotesque life and death kind of stagnation than to see the clock of history tick its last second. Cruel April stirs to life creatures who would rather remain buried, essentially undead, not only because life is suffering, but more particularly because in Eliot's adaptation of the fertility rituals collected in the Golden Bough, the continuation of life spells their actual death. The old priest, the old king, the old god must die so that the new one can be born. The seasonal or historical cycle is in limbo till it happens. A condition of Gothic horror in Eliot's rendering, but the necessity of whose end the inhabitants have so far refused to accept because of the cost to themselves, namely the death of their world. The wasteland is more concrete than the hollow men, though. What is at stake in this poem is clearly not the end of humanity or the end of the earth, but the end of a particular civilization and its replacement with an unknowable successor. What is that sound high in the air? Murmur of maternal lamentation. Who are those hooded hordes swarming over endless plains, stumbling in cracked earth, ringed by the flat horizon only? What is the city over the mountains, cracks and reforms and bursts in the violet air? Falling towers, Jerusalem, Athens, Alexandria, Vienna, London, unreal. The city over the mountains could be any or all of those on the list of falling towers. What's important is that the city cracks, reforms, and bursts, suggesting the cycles of history. The bursting is never painless, thus the sound of maternal lamentation that fills the air. But there's always something new on the horizon. Those hooded hordes stumbling now, but massing, swarming, to sweep away the decayed civilization and gradually to form something of their own, to build a new city. Eliot's thinking clearly echoes that of Spengler and of Hermann Hesse, whom he quotes in his note to these lines. Through its myriad allusions, what Eliot renders in The Wasteland is a harrowing vision of the obliteration of everything one treasures in one's own culture, alongside everything one detests, of course, but love is stronger than hate. We leave his speaker grasping and hoarding whatever bits he can gather from the wreckage and preserve to sustain himself. These fragments I have shored against my ruins, he says in nearly the poem's final line. Is Eliot not foreseeing merely 100 years too early the cultural deconstruction of which I've been speaking? He always already knew it was coming. His poems try to think through this situation over and over. How does one process, how does one accept the end of one's world? In Journey of the Magi, the first of Eliot's Ariel poems, the speaker witnesses the nativity and comments that although what he saw was a birth, this birth was hard and bitter agony for us, like death, our death. The self he was before he encountered the divine is gone. But the situation quickly reaches beyond the personal to the cultural. We returned to our places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation with an alien people clutching their gods. In this case, the Magus has died to the life of his own people, finding himself caught between a world that is dead to him and another to which he will never belong. I should be glad of another death, he concludes. In Eliot's second Ariel poem, A Song for Simeon, the outcome is the same. Here, the speaker has accepted Christ's divinity, but finds himself too old to inhabit the new world coming into being around him. Not for me, the martyrdom, the ecstasy of thought and prayer. Not for me, the ultimate vision. Grant me thy peace. He too would be glad of another death, praying, let thy servant depart, having seen thy salvation. Even those who, like Simeon, believe in the rightness of a new world, who accept its necessity, these poems seem to say, are as likely as not unable to enter into it. In all these poems, and sometimes even more explicitly in his prose, Eliot foresees the end of his world, or you might even say our world, and he strives for perspective on its death. I've been suggesting that Eliot's future is tied less to the vagaries of his own reputation than to the fate of the culture in which his work is embedded. Eliot has long been treated as a poet, not as a poet and a critic, but as a symbol, as the paragon, the embodiment of the humanist tradition. There are ways in which that view of him is sensible and others in which it runs to excess, even as we've seen, to the point of falsification. Nonetheless, T.S. Eliot has carried that meaning for 100 years, and at this point, one might as well admit that among all his worn coins, this one is unlikely to wear out. To think about Eliot's future, then, is to contemplate the future of humanist culture. And to project a future in which he is not read is to imagine, or try to imagine, the reality of a thoroughly post-humanist culture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. That was wonderfully provocative. We're running a bit late, but I think we have time for a couple of questions, maybe one on site and one online. I think people may have questions or maybe answers to the question in your title. Have we got any questions? Anyone online? Yeah, maybe you can you stand up and use that mic there? There. It's a bit high.
Well, I think we can take it. Yeah. Well, thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask you, or maybe to, I don't know, throw out the question, maybe that Eliot might live, whether you think Eliot might live through his understanding, how his understanding of making literature has passed on in the institutionalization of modernist techniques, and how even contemporary writers continue to draw on concepts that Eliot and other modernists sort of passed forward, and how that may actually seep or serve to map critique of contemporary times and therefore bring them to the fore today.
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting question. So basically, might Eliot live through his innovations in technique? Might he maintain a reputation and a readership because of his experimental achievements? Maybe. I never want to say definitively no, but as I said in my talk, there are, poetry since his time has continued to be experimental, and those techniques continue to be used. So it's not necessarily the case that young poets or students must learn modernist technique through Eliot. If you turn to creative writing classrooms, for example, to workshops, certainly a lot of what's taught is descended technically from modernism, but is Eliot presented as the source of those writing techniques? Well, sometimes, but usually not. There are other poets, even contemporary poets, from whom students can learn those innovative or at least then innovated poetic techniques. So possibly, but I'm not sure.
Okay, we have another question from Larissa Mihailova.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for a provocative lecture. And my question is about transhumanism and humanism. Actually, do you really think that humanism is connected only to Christian tradition and European Christian tradition? As we look at the cultures throughout the history of our planet, and the more we look in this post-colonial vein at different cultures, the more humanism nodes and intertwined movements that somehow like spiral going together and arriving at similar actually sensibilities and similar ideas come to mind. So why call it transhumanism then? Maybe it will be some synthesis of these humanisms.
That's an interesting idea. I would just say humanism is one of those, like modernism really, is one of those terms that has several different meanings. I meant specifically what Eliot meant in his occasional references to humanism, not Irving Babbitt's humanism, which he debates, but humanism in the sense of of modern European culture from the Renaissance forward. But you're asking, can Eliot be read in a context of, other humanisms? Is that it?
So I'm actually was speaking about transhumanism. Why does it mean that there is certain second, end of this Europe or whatever?
I see.
Just if we look at this, even if we look only at Eliot in the future, there will be frames both having historical tradition to humanism, but these new sort of understanding of how humans can live together and go on together.
So we're imagining an expanded humanism of the future then, rather than humanism merely as Eliot conceived it, right? Is it possible that Eliot will have a place in that transhumanist world? Well, yeah. It's hard to know the future, and I try to look at a number of ways in my talk in which my argument might be, as I said, alarmist, or might be too gloomy about Eliot's future. And what you're suggesting is another way that bears examination, and I'd like to think about it. The thing is, who knows what transhumanism will look like, right? This is something that perhaps is coming into being, beginning to form out there on the horizon, like Eliot's hooded hordes. Perhaps that will be a different future, a less black and white future than I envisioned in my talk. That's an interesting idea. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we need to close now. Thank you very, very much, David, for that wonderful talk. And please join me in thanking David again. Thank you very much.